There are stories history prefers not to tell out loud, not because they are untrue, but because they are inconvenient. This is one of those stories. It begins with a warning that sounds almost backward in a world obsessed with information, intelligence, and knowing more than everyone else. A warning that says, sometimes, knowledge does not set you free. Sometimes, it marks you. In the American South, during the height of slavery, there was an unspoken rule more powerful than chains or whips. A rule enforced not by law books alone, but by fear. Enslaved people were expected to work, to obey, to survive, but never to understand. Understanding was dangerous. Awareness was a threat, and knowledge was unforgivable. This story is not about rebellion. It is not about escape, and it is not about heroism in the way history likes to remember it. It is about a man who knew too much, not rumors, not guesses, facts about the people who owned him, facts about what happened behind closed doors, facts about things that were never meant to be spoken, especially not by someone in his position. What makes this story unsettling is not what he did with that knowledge, but what that knowledge did to him, because long before anyone accused him of anything, before punishment, before disappearance, the moment he learned the truth, his fate was already changing, quietly, invisibly, irreversibly, and that is the part history rarely explains. We are taught that ignorance is weakness, that knowledge is power, that information is always the path forward, but in certain times, in certain places, knowing the wrong thing did not empower you, it isolated you, it made you visible. It made you dangerous in the eyes of those who had everything to lose. This is the story of how one enslaved man crossed an invisible line without ever stepping out of place, how simply knowing became a crime, and how the consequences were not sudden, but slow, deliberate, and final. Before we go any further, understand this: nothing in this story is exaggerated, nothing is symbolic, and nothing ends cleanly. If stories like this matter to you, stories history tried to bury, then stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories travel far, and it matters who's listening, because once you hear what he knew, you'll understand why some truths were never meant to survive. If you had passed by it without stopping, you would not have remembered it. That was the first thing that made the place so effective at hiding what happened there. The plantation sat low against the land, stretched wide rather than tall, surrounded by fields that seemed endless in summer and lifeless in winter. The soil was dark and heavy, the kind that stuck to boots and swallowed footprints by morning. From a distance it looked like dozens of others scattered across the American South in the early 19th century, productive, quiet, disciplined. This was not a place of chaos, it was a place of order. The year was somewhere in the early 1800s, before the Civil War, when slavery was not only legal but methodical. Every day followed a rhythm that almost felt intentional. Sunrise, labor, silence, rest, repeat. Bells marked time, overseers enforced it, and everyone enslaved or free understood their role without needing to ask. The main house stood slightly elevated, whitewashed and symmetrical, its windows always open during warmer months, as if inviting air but not people. Beyond it were the quarters, arranged neatly enough to suggest care, but close enough to remind their occupants they were never out of sight. Paths were worn into the dirt, not because people chose them, but because deviation was discouraged. This plantation did not have a reputation for cruelty that mattered. Places known for open brutality were expected to produce horror. This one, however, prided itself on appearing controlled, efficient, respectable. It was the kind of plantation neighbors pointed to as an example of how things were supposed to work. Violence, when it happened, was private, consequences were quiet, and problems were handled without spectacle, which is why no one would have suspected that something dangerous was already present there, something invisible. During the day, the fields swallowed sound, cotton plants whispered in the wind, tools scraped against earth, voices stayed low. At night, the land changed. Crickets filled the silence, and the dark erased boundaries, but even then, movement was minimal. People learned early that stillness drew less attention than action. It was in this environment, predictable, repetitive, controlled, that knowledge became especially dangerous. Because when nothing appears out of place, anything that doesn't belong stands out immediately. This plantation ran on information: who worked where, who was sick, who was missing, who spoke to whom. Overseers reported upward, house servants overheard everything, and slaveholders believed they understood the flow of information completely. They were wrong. The man at the center of this story lived and worked here for years without incident. He blended into the routine so well that he became unremarkable. And in a place like this, being unremarkable was survival. He was not chained. He was not isolated. He was not rebellious. He was trusted just enough. and that trust placed him closer to conversations, documents, and moments that were never meant for him. It allowed him to exist in spaces where silence was expected, not comprehension, where presence did not imply understanding. But the land itself seemed to notice before the people did. Small things changed. Pauses lingered longer. Looks held a fraction too long. Words were chosen more carefully around him, though no one could explain why. The plantation remained orderly, yet something beneath that order began to tighten. Because the most dangerous secrets do not announce themselves. They settle into places that look ordinary. They wait in rooms where nothing ever seems to happen. And when they are finally discovered, the place that once felt safe becomes impossible to escape. This plantation was not unusual. That was the problem, because what happened here was not an exception. It was a warning hidden inside routine, and the man who lived here had not yet realized that the ground beneath him was already shifting quietly, patiently toward consequences he could not see coming. He did not stand out. That was the first thing everyone noticed, and the last thing anyone questioned. On the plantation, he moved the way someone moves when they have learned, over time, that survival depends on not being memorable. His posture was neutral, his expression unreadable. He worked with consistency, not speed, with care, not enthusiasm. Nothing about him suggested defiance, intelligence, or ambition, and that was precisely why no one suspected what he carried. He was assigned work that shifted over the years, sometimes in the fields, sometimes near the main house, occasionally tasked with errands that required him to pass through spaces most enslaved people never entered, kitchens, storage rooms, corridors where conversations dropped into whispers rather than silence. He listened without appearing to listen. That skill alone took years to develop, because on plantations like this one, enslaved people were surrounded by words they were never meant to absorb. Orders, plans, arguments, confessions spoken freely under the assumption that the listener lacked either the intelligence or the permission to understand. The system depended on that assumption. It was how information remained controlled. He never challenged it. When spoken to, he answered simply. When ignored, he stayed invisible. When addressed harshly, he lowered his eyes. Everything about his behavior reinforced the belief that he was harmless. But knowledge does not always arrive through teaching. Sometimes it arrives through proximity. Sometimes it slips in through repetition. Sometimes it settles quietly when no one thinks to guard against it. He learned patterns first, who spoke loudly, who spoke in private, who changed their tone when certain names were mentioned. He learned which doors stayed closed and which ones were only meant to appear that way. He learned which nights the house stayed awake later than usual, and which mornings felt heavier than others. None of that was forbidden on its own. But together, it formed a picture. At some point there is never a clear moment he crossed from awareness into understanding. Not because he wanted to. Not because he sought it out, but because once you see enough pieces, they begin to arrange themselves without permission. And that is when he became dangerous. Not in action, not in intent, but in potential. On plantations, enslaved people were expected to know how to work but never why things happened. They were expected to hear words, but not to connect them. To witness events, but not to interpret them. Knowledge that went beyond task and obedience was seen as contamination, especially knowledge about the people in power. He understood this instinctively. That was why he never reacted, never asked questions, never changed his routine. The more he understood, the more carefully he behaved. But knowledge changes the body before it changes behavior. It sharpens awareness, it alters perception, it creates pauses where there were none before, and people notice pauses. The overseers did not accuse him of anything, the slaveholders did not confront him, no one said his name with suspicion, but something subtle began to shift in how he was treated. Conversations stopped a fraction earlier when he entered a room. Instructions became more specific. Trust, once loosely granted, became conditional. Still, nothing overt happened, because at this stage, knowledge alone was not enough to destroy him. It had to be confirmed, and confirmation requires a secret. No one ever sat him down and taught him anything. That is what made the knowledge so dangerous. On plantations like this one, education was not simply discouraged, it was controlled. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read in many parts of the South, and even when laws were loosely enforced, the rule remained absolute in practice. Knowledge was power, and power was not meant to circulate freely. But information does not require permission to exist. It only requires access. And his access came quietly, disguised as usefulness. He was not chosen because he was smart. He was chosen because he was dependable, because he followed instructions without hesitation, because he could be trusted to carry messages, to stand in rooms without interrupting, to remain present without appearing engaged. Trust like that is dangerous when misplaced. At first, his proximity to information felt accidental. He stood near doorways while conversations unfolded behind him. He waited outside offices while voices drifted through thin walls. He carried trays into rooms where arguments had not yet ended. And because no one addressed him directly, no one adjusted their words. People speak freely when they believe they are unheard. He learned names before he learned meanings. Names spoken sharply, names avoided entirely, names that caused a shift in tone the moment they were mentioned. Over time, he noticed how certain topics were discussed only indoors, with windows closed, how certain nights brought unfamiliar visitors, how the mood of the house changed before news ever reached the fields. But the most dangerous knowledge did not come from conversations. It came from repetition. He began to recognize documents by their weight and handling, papers that were folded carefully, letters sealed and resealed, records that were hidden quickly when footsteps approached. He did not read them, not at first, but he noticed how urgently they were protected. Later, when reading became unavoidable, it happened not through instruction but exposure. Words repeated themselves. Dates appeared again and again. Locations were spoken with care, never casually. And slowly, without ceremony, symbols began to connect. Not fluently, not confidently, but enough. Enough to understand what others assumed he could not. This was not a moment of revelation. It was a gradual accumulation, like water seeping into cracks until the structure itself begins to weaken. He did not wake up one morning knowing too much. He woke up knowing slightly more than the day before until the difference mattered. And still he said nothing. That silence is important, because silence was his protection. He understood instinctively that knowledge, once acknowledged, became evidence. So he behaved exactly as he always had. He performed ignorance so convincingly that it reassured those around him. But the problem with forbidden knowledge is not that it tempts you to speak, it's that it changes how you listen. He began to anticipate conversations before they happened. He understood implications without needing explanations. He noticed when stories didn't align, when timelines overlapped in ways they shouldn't. He recognized fear in voices that were otherwise confident, and fear always points to something valuable. The plantation operated on a hierarchy of secrets. Some were minor financial disagreements, personal scandals, private conflicts. Others were structural, tied to land, money, and power beyond the plantation itself. And somewhere between those layers, he discovered something he was never meant to touch. The first real secret. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent, and at first it didn't seem dangerous at all. But it explained too much. It explained behavior. It explained silence. It explained why certain people were protected while others were discarded. And once you understand why a system behaves the way it does, you can no longer pretend you don't see it. That was the moment his knowledge crossed a threshold. Because now, even if he remained silent, he was no longer harmless. He had become a liability simply by understanding. The first secret did not arrive with drama. There was no raised voice, no argument behind closed doors, no sudden realization that made his heart race. That is why it stayed with him. It revealed itself slowly, through details that did not belong together, at least not at first. A name repeated too often, a date mentioned out of season, a delivery that arrived late at night instead of during daylight hours. None of it was illegal, none of it was violent, but all of it was deliberate. The plantation kept records of everything: crops, supplies, purchases, movements. On paper, it was a well-run operation, but there were inconsistencies, more ones that no one bothered to hide, because no one believed they needed to. He noticed that certain shipments were recorded twice, but accounted for once. That some goods were marked as damaged, yet still moved off the property. That money changed hands quietly between men who otherwise had no reason to meet. These were not mistakes, they were habits, and habits reveal intention. At first he assumed it was none of his concern. Slaveholders stole from one another constantly through inflated numbers, false losses, quiet exchanges. It was part of the economy. But the more he observed, the clearer it became that this wasn't simple dishonesty. It was coordination. Several Manonas, overseers, outside traders were tied together by something that required discretion, something that could not withstand attention. The plantation was not just producing crops, it was facilitating movement of goods, of money, of information, and it was doing so in a way that relied on silence. That silence was enforced not only through fear, but through familiarity. Everyone involved behaved as if this arrangement had existed long before him, and would continue long after. It was spoken of indirectly, referenced through euphemism, protected through routine. He understood then why certain questions were never asked. why certain workers were reassigned without explanation, why the plantation's public reputation mattered so much to its owners. This first secret explained the contradictions, why the plantation appeared orderly, yet carried tension beneath the surface, why outsiders were welcomed selectively, why some problems were resolved quickly, while others disappeared without resolution. It also explained why enslaved people were never meant to understand the system they supported, because understanding creates leverage, even if that leverage is never used. The moment he recognized this secret for what it was, he stopped being just a laborer within the system. He became someone who could see its structure, and systems do not tolerate being seen from the inside. Still, he did nothing. He did not speak, he did not react, he did not change. But secrets have weight. They alter the way you stand in a room, the way you interpret silence, the way you hear casual remarks and understand what they're avoiding. And even when you try to carry that weight quietly, it leaves marks. The plantation sensed it before it identified it. The first secret alone would not have destroyed him, but it positioned him closer to danger than anyone realized. Because once you understand one hidden layer, you begin to recognize others, and some layers are not meant to be uncovered at all. The next secret would not be about goods or money, it would be about people. The second secret did not reveal itself through patterns or paperwork, it revealed itself through fear. Unlike the first, which explained how the plantation worked, this one explained how it protected itself. And once he understood that, there was no safe way to pretend ignorance ever again. It began with a change in behavior among people who had never been careful before. Voices lowered when certain individuals were nearby. Conversations ended abruptly, not because of authority, but because of presence. Men who once spoke freely now chose their words with precision, as if afraid that even the wrong phrasing could travel further than intended. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but fear has a rhythm, and once you hear it enough times, you recognize it immediately. He learned that not everyone on the plantation was equally even among those who held power. Some men were protected in ways others were not. Their mistakes disappeared. Their absences were excused. Their involvement in questionable dealings was quietly ignored. Others were disposable. That distinction mattered, because the second secret was not about what was happening, it was about who was responsible. Names that never appeared in records. Decisions made verbally, never written down. Orders that came without explanation, passed along as if they originated from nowhere at all. This was the true structure of power, and he had seen enough to understand it. He realized that the plantation was part of something larger than itself, a network of relationships bound not by law, but by mutual exposure. Everyone involved knew just enough about the others to ensure cooperation and silence. And then he overheard something he was never meant to hear, not a confession, not a threat, a reassurance. One man telling another that it would be handled, just as it always had been before. That no one outside needed to know. That the people involved were already dealt with. That phrase stayed with him. Already dealt with. He did not know exactly what it meant at first, but he understood what it implied. Problems did not escalate here. They vanished, quietly, permanently, without records or witnesses. And suddenly, the reassigned workers made sense. The unexplained disappearances, the gaps in memory among those who remained. This second secret reframed everything he thought he knew about the plantation. It was not simply exploitative, it was controlled, not just harsh but efficient, and efficiency requires elimination. What made this secret worse than the first was not its scale, but its proximity. He was no longer observing corruption from a distance. He was now aware of how quickly a person could move from inconvenience to liability. And he understood something else, something deeply unsettling. He fit the pattern. He was present in places he wasn't meant to be. He noticed things others overlooked. And worst of all, he remembered, knowledge like that does not need to be shared to be dangerous. The possibility that it could be shared is enough. He became hyper-aware of himself, of how often he was seen, of who noticed him listening, of how his presence might now be interpreted in retrospect as suspicious, even if it never had been before. This is the part of the story where people assume there must have been a mistake. A moment where he should have stopped, turned away, chosen not to know more. But that choice no longer existed, because the second secret did not require curiosity. It required only proximity. And now that he understood the rules of disappearance, every silence felt heavier, every delay felt intentional, every glance felt like assessment. The plantation had not accused him of anything, but it no longer needed to, because once you understand how power removes problems, you begin to realize how easily you can become one. On plantations like this one, violence was not the foundation of control. Predictability was. The system did not survive because people were beaten every day. It survived because everyone understood the limits where they could go, what they could say, and most importantly, what they were allowed to know. Knowledge disrupted that balance. It introduced variables, and variables were dangerous. From the outside, it might seem excessive punishing someone not for what they did, but for what they understood. But within the logic of slavery, it made perfect sense. Slavery depended on hierarchy, not just physical hierarchy, but mental hierarchy. Enslaved people were expected to internalize the idea that they were incapable of comprehension beyond their assigned tasks. That belief was reinforced constantly through law, religion, routine, and fear. Once that belief cracked, the entire structure became unstable. Because a person who understands the system can question it, even silently. This is why knowledge was regulated so aggressively. Reading was forbidden not because words were dangerous, but because interpretation was. Knowing dates, names, locations, and cause and effect relationships allowed enslaved people to place themselves within a larger reality, one that contradicted the version they were meant to accept. Understanding created comparison, and comparison led to judgment. Plantation owners understood this instinctively. They did not need every enslaved person to be ignorant, only enough of them, enough to prevent collective awareness, enough to ensure that those who did understand remained isolated, unsure of who else might see what they saw. That isolation was crucial. A person who knows something dangerous but believes they are alone in that knowledge becomes cautious, paranoid, silent. The system relied on that psychological pressure. It turned knowledge inward, making it a burden rather than a weapon. And when knowledge did escape that isolation, when it spread, it was dealt with swiftly, not publicly, not loudly, but decisively. This is where the idea of crime becomes important. In many cases, there was no formal accusation, no written charge, no trial. Knowledge itself was treated as intent. Understanding was interpreted as future rebellion, even if no rebellion had occurred. The logic was simple. If you know enough to explain the system, you know enough to threaten it, and threats were eliminated before they matured. This is why the man in this story had already crossed a line without realizing it. He had not broken a rule. He had not disobeyed an order. He had not spoken out, but he had achieved something far more dangerous: clarity. He understood who benefited. He understood who disappeared. He understood how silence was enforced. That understanding alone placed him outside the role he was meant to occupy. And systems built on control cannot tolerate ambiguity in roles. What made this particularly dangerous was that knowledge is invisible. You cannot see it. You cannot easily prove it. You can only infer it through behavior, through pauses, through choices, through the way someone reacts or doesn't react to information. This created a constant state of surveillance, not formal surveillance, but social observation. Who listens too closely? Who remembers details? Who connects events that others dismiss? People learned to monitor one another, not out of loyalty, but out of fear, because being associated with someone who knew too much could make you suspect as well. That fear kept the system intact, and it explains why punishment often appeared disproportionate, why consequences seemed sudden, why people vanished without explanation. These were not emotional reactions, they were preventative measures. The plantation did not wait for proof. It waited for risk. By the time someone was identified as knowing too much, the decision had often already been made. Action followed recognition, not investigation. This is the context the man lived in, whether he understood it consciously or not. Every day he carried knowledge that could not be acknowledged, shared, or forgotten. Every day he existed in a state of potential violation. And the most terrifying part, he still believed that silence would protect him. There is always a moment when knowledge stops feeling abstract, a moment when it shifts from something you carry in your mind to something that presses against your body, tightens your chest, changes the way you breathe. The moment when understanding becomes irreversible. For him, it did not happen during a conversation or an argument. It happened in silence. He was standing in a familiar place when he had passed through countless times without consequence. The hour was late enough that most of the house had settled, but not so late that activity had completely stopped. Oil lamps were still lit in certain rooms. Footsteps echoed occasionally, careful and measured. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic. That's what made it unbearable. He overheard a brief exchange, only a few words, spoken casually, almost carelessly. No names were mentioned, no details explained, but the context was unmistakable now. He understood exactly what was being referenced, exactly what had already happened, and exactly what was expected to happen next. There was no confusion, no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The system he had slowly pieced together was suddenly complete, and once complete, it could not be undone. In that instant, his understanding sharpened into something precise and terrifying. Knowledge was not dangerous because it inspired action. It was dangerous because it removed uncertainty. It clarified who was protected, who was expendable, and how quickly the transition between those categories could occur. He realized then that silence was no longer neutral. Before, silence had been safety, a way to remain unnoticed, a way to exist without attracting interest. But now, silence had a different meaning. It could be interpreted as restraint or as calculation, and calculation implied intent. He became aware of his body in a way he never had before, of where he stood, of how long he had been there, of whether anyone had noticed his presence. Every second stretched, heavy with implication. He did not move immediately. Movement itself felt dangerous, because movement could suggest reaction, and reaction could suggest understanding. This is the paradox of forbidden knowledge. Once you possess it, every behavior becomes evidence. Stillness can look like composure. Composure can look like confidence. And confidence, in someone who should have none, invites scrutiny. He understood then that forgetting was impossible. You cannot unknow a system once you understand how it functions. You cannot return to ignorance once patterns align. And you cannot pretend innocence when your awareness has altered the way you perceive the world. The plantation had not changed. The routines continued. The work resumed the next morning. Orders were given. Tasks were completed. From the outside, nothing was different. But internally, everything had shifted. He no longer saw individual actions, he saw processes. He no longer heard isolated conversations, he heard coordination. He no longer viewed authority as singular. He recognized its network, and networks protect themselves. That realization carried a second, quieter one. He was no longer merely witnessing danger. He was now inside its radius. The people involved did not need to know exactly what he had learned. They only needed to sense that he might know something. Suspicion does not require proof. It requires only possibility. And possibility had just become unavoidable. From that moment on, time began to feel different. Days were no longer units of labor, they were intervals of exposure. Each interaction became a calculation. Each instruction carried subtext. Each glance lingered a fraction longer than before. He started to notice how often his presence coincided with sudden silence. Whether that silence was intentional or imagined no longer mattered. The effect was the same. This was the point of no return. Not because anyone had threatened him, not because anyone had accused him, but because the balance had shifted. And balances, once disturbed, demand correction. Suspicion does not announce itself. It does not arrive with accusations or confrontation. It enters quietly, through subtle adjustments that are easy to dismiss until they aren't. At first, nothing changed in ways that could be named. He was still given work, still spoken to when necessary, still allowed to move through the same spaces he always had. But the tone shifted. Instructions became shorter, less conversational. Requests that once came casually were now delivered with formality, as if creating distance where none had existed before. Distance is the first signal. He noticed that people no longer filled silence around him. Where conversation once flowed uninterrupted, there were now pauses, small, deliberate breaks, where someone seemed to reconsider their words, mid-sentence. Jokes stopped short. Explanations were simplified unnecessarily, as if he needed them stripped of context. It was not hostility, it was assessment. Suspicion often begins not with belief, but with uncertainty, and uncertainty makes people cautious. They begin to watch for confirmation, for evidence that justifies a feeling they can't yet explain. He became aware that his presence was being noted, not overtly. No one stared. No one followed him, but he sensed that moments were being remembered, that interactions were being revisited after the fact, examined for meaning they might not have carried at the time. Had he been listening too closely? Had he reacted too quickly? Had he understood something he shouldn't have? These questions did not need answers to be dangerous. They only needed to exist. The system did not require certainty to act, it required risk management. He responded the only way he knew how, by becoming smaller, quieter, more precise. He avoided eye contact longer than usual. He spoke only when spoken to. He made his movements predictable, his behavior unremarkable. But suspicion does not recede once it begins, because caution itself can be misinterpreted. Restraint can look like control. Control can look like confidence. And confidence, in someone who is expected to have none, raises questions. He realized this too late. People began to test boundaries without realizing they were doing it. A comment dropped intentionally vague, to see if he reacted. A detail mentioned incorrectly, to see if he corrected it. A question framed casually, but aimed carefully. He never took the bait. But avoiding traps requires awareness, and awareness leaves traces. He noticed that his work assignments shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to reduce his proximity to certain spaces. He was no longer sent on errands that passed through the main house as often. His tasks became more isolated, more physical, less informational. This was not punishment. It was containment. Containment is what systems do when they are unsure but unwilling to wait. He also noticed how others behaved around him. Some avoided him entirely, not out of dislike, but fear. Association itself felt risky. Others were overly polite, as if trying to gauge his temperament. A few watched him carefully, their expressions unreadable. Suspicion spreads laterally before it moves upward. It moves through whispers, through glances, through intuition. It does not require agreement-only attention. The most unsettling part was that no one confronted him. Confrontation invites denial. Denial invites argument. Argument invites exposure. The system preferred ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed action without justification. And so the days passed. Heavy with unspoken evaluation, he felt himself living inside a narrowing corridor of acceptable behavior. Every action was measured against an invisible standard he could not see. Every silence risked being interpreted as calculation. Every compliance risked being seen as strategy. This is how suspicion suffocates, not through force, but through pressure. He still believed he could outlast it, that if he remained careful long enough, attention would drift elsewhere. That suspicion would dissolve without confirmation. But suspicion does not need confirmation to escalate. It only needs time. And time, on a plantation like this, belonged to the people who controlled consequences. From the outside, it would have looked like nothing changed. He still woke before dawn, still followed instructions, still kept his head down and his words minimal. Anyone watching casually would have seen routine continuing exactly as it always had. But internally, the pressure had reached a point where doing nothing was no longer neutral. This is the lie. Systems like this depend on that silence is always a choice, that restraint is voluntary, that survival comes from deciding correctly. He understood now that every possible path carried risk. Speaking was impossible. Silence was suspicious. Movement invited attention. Stillness suggested calculation. There was no behavior left that could not be misinterpreted, and yet he still had to choose something. The choice did not come as a single moment of decision. There was no dramatic pause where he weighed his options under the stars. Instead, it formed gradually, through exhaustion, through the mental strain of constant vigilance, through the realization that existing in permanent anticipation of danger was unsustainable. He chose to lean further into invisibility. Not because he believed it would save him, but because it was the only option that did not immediately accelerate suspicion. He withdrew socially. He avoided even casual interaction. He positioned himself where oversight was minimal, even if the work was harder. He declined opportunities subtly, respectfully, that might place him near the main house or in shared spaces. That is the cruel paradox at the center of this story. He could feel the narrowing now, not physically, but structurally. Fewer options, less flexibility, less tolerance for ambiguity. The plantation was adjusting around him, responding not to what he had done, but to what he might do. He also understood something else, something deeply unsettling. This was no longer about him. Once suspicion enters a system, it seeks resolution. And resolution requires an outcome. Innocence is rarely satisfying. Uncertainty is unacceptable. The system needed closure, whether justified or not. That meant his behavior was no longer the determining factor. Because the system was now responding to its own fear. A confrontation. A final act of defiance. But those are stories shaped by hindsight and imagination. Real life, especially under total control, rarely offers such clarity. He continued to work, continued to obey, continued to exist. And in doing so, he unknowingly allowed the next phase to begin. Because while he believed he was minimizing risk, something else was happening around him, something he could not control, could not predict, and could not stop. The knowledge he carried was no longer contained within him. It was beginning to move. But through the most dangerous mechanism of all, other people. Secrets rarely spread the way people expect. They don't move through confessions or dramatic revelations. They move through proximity, inference, and fear. through the quiet adjustments people make when they sense something is wrong even if they don't know exactly what it is. In this case, the secret did not leave him because he chose to share it. It left him because others began to notice what he no longer could hide. The first signs were subtle. Someone hesitated before speaking around him, then later repeated the same hesitation around others. A task was reassigned without explanation, and the reason for that reassignment was discussed elsewhere, stripped of names but heavy with implication. A look exchanged between two men lingered just long enough to suggest understanding. None of this required words. People are skilled at reading tension, especially in environments where survival depends on it. Enslaved people learned early how to sense danger in tone, posture, silence. So did overseers. So did those who benefited most from keeping things quiet. Someone noticed that he avoided certain spaces now. Someone else noticed that he no longer asked questions he had once asked casually. Someone else noticed that he remembered things too accurately, that he followed instructions with an awareness that suggested comprehension rather than obedience. Each observation alone meant nothing. Together they formed a narrative, and narratives do not need to be true to be powerful, they only need to be plausible. The secret began to exist independently of him. It transformed from something he carried into something others suspected. Not specifically, not clearly, but enough to create alignment, enough for people to compare notes. Enough for concerns to move upward without being fully articulated. This is how systems protect themselves, not through evidence, but through consensus. Someone likely said something vague to someone else. A comment like, "He's sharper than he looks," or "He's been around more than most." No accusation, just implication. Implication is safer. It invites agreement without responsibility. An agreement spreads faster than truth. Once suspicion reached a certain threshold, it no longer mattered what he actually knew. The risk was no longer informational, it was symbolic. He represented uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts control. What made this phase especially dangerous was that it unfolded beyond his awareness. He could feel tension, but he could not see its movement. Conversations happened without him. Decisions were influenced indirectly. Assessments were made based on second-hand impressions. By the time a system begins to act, the target is often the last to know. This is why secrecy is not a shield. It delays exposure, but it does not prevent interpretation. People do not need confirmation to believe something feels wrong, and once that belief exists, it seeks resolution. The plantation's structure was not designed to investigate it, was designed to eliminate variables. And now, he had become one. He noticed that others avoided being seen with him, that casual interactions became rare, that even those who once relied on him now kept their distance, not out of malice, but self-preservation. Association itself had become dangerous. This is how isolation deepens, not through orders or punishment, but through social withdrawal, through the quiet understanding that proximity to risk can transfer that risk. By the time he realized how far the suspicion had traveled, it was no longer something he could contain. The secret had leaked not as information, but as possibility, and possibility was enough. Because once a system decides that a person might know too much, it begins preparing for what comes next. The night did not announce itself as important. There were no raised voices, no sudden urgency, no sense that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. In fact, what made it significant was how closely it resembled every other night that came before it. The air was heavy, thick with heat that refused to lift, even after the sun disappeared. Insects filled the darkness with a constant, uneven sound. Lamps were extinguished one by one, until only a few remained lit near the main house. From a distance, the plantation appeared calm, settled into its familiar rhythm, but routines only feel permanent until the moment they break. You notice small deviations first, not dramatic ones, just enough to unsettle someone who had learned to read patterns, a delay in the usual signals, footsteps moving where they normally wouldn't, voices carried farther than expected, then stopped abruptly. He did not know the date with certainty, but later accounts would place it in late summer when nights were long, and workdays were already exhausting. The kind of night when mistakes felt more likely, and patience thinner. He was not summoned, that was important. No one called his name, no order was given, nothing occurred that required his immediate response. If anything, he was left alone more deliberately than usual, as if the system had decided he no longer needed instruction. That alone should have been a warning, because systems that rely on control do not withdraw attention without reason. He stayed where he was told to stay. He did not move unnecessarily. He did not seek information. He did not listen at doors or linger near lighted windows. He behaved exactly as expected, quiet, compliant, unremarkable. Still, something felt wrong. The plantation did not sleep the way it normally did. There was an underlying tension, subtle but persistent, like a held breath that refused to release. Activity continued in pockets, disconnected but purposeful. People moved with intent, not routine. At some point, he realized he was being avoided. Not ignored, avoided. Paths that usually crossed did not. People who normally passed near him took longer routes. Even the sounds of others seemed to recede, leaving him in an unfamiliar stillness. Isolation can be accidental. This was not. Later that night there was movement near the edges of the property, not hurried, not secretive, controlled, as if whatever needed to happen was already decided, and all that remained was execution. He did not see everything. That, too, is important. Much of what happened that night was never recorded, never described, never acknowledged. What survived did so through fragments, observations that did not fully connect, silences that spoke louder than testimony. He sensed rather than witnessed the shift. A moment when the atmosphere changed. When the plantation's usual order hardened into something final. When the possibility that had hovered around him for days solidified into certainty. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no chance to explain, deny, or comply further. That is the most unsettling part. The system did not require his participation anymore. At some point before dawn, he understood, without being told, that whatever protection silence had once offered was gone, that his presence had been accounted for, that decisions had been made elsewhere, without his input, without his awareness. The night passed. Morning came as it always did. But something was missing. Not immediately noticeable, not announced, just absent in a way that felt intentional, like a space cleared rather than a mistake made. And in that absence, the plantation returned to routine. Work resumed. Orders were given. The day unfolded as if nothing had occurred. That normalcy was not accidentally, was the final step. Because the most effective systems do not disrupt themselves to resolve a problem. They erase the problem and continue. The consequence did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as absence. By morning the plantation had already adjusted. The system did not pause to acknowledge what had been removed. There was no announcement, no explanation, no visible disruption. Work assignments were redistributed quietly. Tasks were absorbed by others without comment. The routine closed over the gap as if it had always been planned that way. This is how power conceals its actions, not by denying them, but by normalizing their results. No one asked where he was. That silence mattered more than any answer could have. In places like this, questions were dangerous not because they revealed ignorance, but because they suggested memory. Remembering implied comparison, comparison implied judgment, and judgment was never permitted from those without authority. Those who noticed his absence understood instinctively what it meant. They did not speak his name. They did not speculate. They did not grieve openly. They adapted. Fear teaches efficiency quickly. The consequence of knowing was not just what happened to him, it was what happened to everyone else afterward. His disappearance functioned as confirmation, not of guilt, but of rule. It reinforced the unspoken boundary more effectively than any public punishment could have. Knowledge had been identified, and knowledge had been removed. What makes this consequence especially unsettling is that it required no formal justification. There was no record of wrongdoing, no accusation to dispute. The system did not need proof because it was not correcting behavior, it was eliminating risk. From the outside, it would have looked clean. No violence witnessed, no disorder recorded, no accountability required. And that cleanliness was the point. The plantation preserved its reputation. Its operations continued uninterrupted. Whatever had been threatened by his awareness was secured again, not through confrontation, but through erasure. This is why the consequence of knowing is so often misunderstood. People imagine punishment as something loud, something visible, but systems like this prefer consequences that blend into routine, consequences that do not draw attention, consequences that teach through implication rather than spectacle. He had crossed no visible line, but he had crossed the only line that mattered. He had understood, and understanding, once identified, cannot be negotiated with. The people responsible did not need to confirm exactly what he knew. They only needed to believe that he knew enough, enough to connect dots, enough to speak if pressed, enough to exist as a liability. That belief alone justified action. Afterward, behavior on the plantation subtly shifted. Conversations became more guarded, movements more controlled. The boundaries of acceptable curiosity tightened. People learned from what they did not see as much as from what they did. This is how fear is institutionalized. Not through repeated violence, but through selective demonstration. One absence is enough. And the lesson lasted longer than any bruise ever could. What followed was not chaos. it was control. In the days after his absence became noticeably, at least to those who paid attention, the plantation did not react outwardly. There were no inquiries, no punishments announced, no visible tightening of authority. Instead, what unfolded was quieter and far more effective. The system closed ranks. Work schedules were adjusted slightly, just enough to prevent idle time. Movement across the property became more structured, though no new rules were spoken aloud. Tasks that once required cooperation were reorganized to limit unnecessary interaction. None of this was framed as discipline. It was presented as efficiency. Efficiency is often the language power uses when it wants to hide fear. Those who had been closest to him learned quickly not to mention his name, not because they were told not to, but because they understood the implication. Speaking about someone who had vanished invited questions. Questions invited attention, and attention was the last thing anyone wanted. Memory itself became dangerous. People trained themselves to forget details, to blur time, to reinterpret absence as reassignment, punishment elsewhere, or something that had never been clear to begin with. In environments like this, forgetting is not passive, it is practiced. The plantation's leadership benefited from this. By allowing multiple explanations to exist simultaneously, none could be challenged. Ambiguity protected authority better than denial ever could. As long as no single version of events dominated, there was nothing concrete to resist. This is how silence becomes policy. The people who knew the most said the least. Overseers avoided discussing the matter entirely. Owners moved on quickly, redirecting focus to productivity and order. The implication was clear. Whatever had happened was resolved, and resolution meant closure. The plantation did not document his absence. No record marked the change. In official terms, nothing had occurred. This ensured that the story could not survive through evidence, it would have to survive through memory alone. And memory, under pressure, degrades. Over time, details softened, certainty eroded. People remembered the feeling more than the facts. They remembered caution, not context. Fear, not explanation. This was not accidental, it was the outcome the system depended on. Because stories only remain dangerous when they are precise. What happened after was not just about removing one person, it was about reinforcing boundaries, about reminding everyone without saying a word where those boundaries lay. The message was absorbed quickly. People listened less closely. They stopped connecting events. They avoided drawing conclusions that extended beyond their immediate tasks. Curiosity narrowed. Awareness contracted. The plantation returned to its equilibrium, but beneath that equilibrium was a permanent adjustment, a recalibration of risk. A shared understanding that there were things you did not want to understand too well. This is how systems survive exposure, not by eliminating all threats, but by ensuring that the cost of awareness remains too high to risk again. Stories like his do not disappear by accident. They are erased through design. The absence of his name from records was not an oversight, nor was it the result of poor documentation. It was the natural outcome of a system that understood the power of memory and how dangerous it could be if left uncontrolled. Plantations were meticulous about what they recorded. Crops, transactions, births, deaths, punishments, everything that served productivity or legality was written down. But the system was equally deliberate about what it did not record. Events that threatened order, exposed internal contradictions, or revealed the true mechanisms of control were handled informally and forgotten officially. His disappearance fit perfectly into that gap. There was no legal reason to document it. No public incident that required explanation, no body, no charge, no transfer papers. Without paperwork, there was no story that could be challenged, only absence. An absence is easy to ignore. Over time, people stopped noticing the gap entirely. New workers arrived. Roles shifted. The memory of his presence blurred into general familiarity. Without repetition, names fade. Without records, stories lose their anchor. This is how history becomes selective. What survives is not what mattered most, but what was safest to preserve. Even oral memory struggled to carry his story forward. Those who knew the truth also knew the risk of passing it on. Each retelling carried potential consequences. Over time, the details were softened, altered, or omitted entirely. The story became less about him and more about a warning without a source, a feeling without a face, and feelings are easier to dismiss. The broader historical record reflects this pattern. Enslaved people who disappeared rarely left traces unless their absence disrupted property or legal ownership. Lives were recorded only insofar as they intersected with economic value. When a person ceased to matter economically, their story often ended as well. This was not negligence, it was efficiency. The system did not need to remember individuals, it needed to remember rules. And the rule his story reinforced that knowledge carried consequences did not require his name to remain effective. In some cases, fragments survived indirectly. A line in a letter referencing trouble resolved, a change in staffing without explanation, a sudden emphasis on obedience or silence in later years. These traces exist, but they require interpretation, and interpretation is something history often avoids when it complicates the narrative. What remains, then, is not a full account, but a shadow. A pattern repeated often enough to suggest intention, an absence consistent enough to imply design, a silence loud enough to indicate suppression rather than forgetting. His story was almost lost because it was never meant to be found, and yet, its outline persists not in names or dates, but in structure, in the repeated erasure of people who understood too much, in the systems that outlast them by ensuring they are remembered only as cautionary shapes, not as individuals. This is why telling stories like this matters. Not to recover every detail but to recognize the pattern, because when you understand how history chooses what to preserve, you begin to see what else might be missing. This is usually the part where stories tell you what to think, where a lesson is spelled out clearly, tied neatly to a message about courage, resistance, or justice, where the past is framed as something safely distant, tragic, yes, but resolved, contained. This story does not offer that comfort, because the truth it reveals is not confined to history, nor is it limited to slavery, plantations, or the 19th century. What happened to him was not the result of one cruel individual or one corrupt place. It was the outcome of a system behaving exactly as it was designed to behave. That is the part most people struggle with. He did not fail because he acted recklessly. He did not suffer because he sought power. He did not disappear because he challenged authority. He disappeared because he understood it. The system did not punish knowledge out of spite, it punished it out of necessity. Awareness disrupted predictability, understanding created risk, and systems built on control always choose stability over truth. That dynamic does not require chains to function. It only requires hierarchy. Wherever information is unevenly distributed, wherever understanding threatens legitimacy, wherever silence is rewarded and curiosity is contained, this same logic appears, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, often invisibly. The lesson here is not that knowledge is bad. It's that knowledge is contextual. What you know matters less than where you know it, who you know it around, and whether the system you exist within can tolerate your awareness. In environments where power depends on opacity, clarity becomes dangerous. He learned something no one taught him. He carried it without speaking, and still, it cost him everything. That is not a cautionary tale about curiosity, it is a warning about structure. History often celebrates knowledge as progress, and in many cases it is. But progress is not automatic. It is negotiated, resisted, filtered through power, and sometimes it is delayed by making examples of those who arrive at understanding too early, or without permission. The reason his story matters is not because it is unique. It matters because it is familiar, because versions of this story repeat wherever systems rely on silence, wherever consequences are hidden, wherever truth is treated as a liability rather than a value. The tools change, the language changes, the context changes, the mechanism does not. And that is why his name was never recorded, not because he was insignificant, but because remembering him clearly would require acknowledging what the system was willing to do to protect itself. It is easier to forget individuals than to confront structures. So there is no moral here to follow, no instruction to act bravely or remain silent, only an understanding that knowledge is never neutral, that awareness is not always safe, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is see the system as it truly is, not because you plan to challenge it, but because once you do, it may decide it no longer needs you to exist. And that is a truth history rarely says out loud. Stay tuned for next exciting videos.